Agnes Brolin was 70 years old when she first understood that love could be invisible. For 46 years, she had lived on the dairy farm in Richland County, Wisconsin, as the wife of Earl Brolin, a quiet man with hands that knew soil and animals better than people. They had never had children together, though Earl brought two from his first marriage, Craig, now 47, and Diane, now 44. Agnes had raised them alongside the cows in the seasons, had taught them to read in the farmhouse kitchen while the wind rattled the windows in winter, had held their hands through schoolyard disappointments and adolescent awkwardness. She had become their mother in every way that mattered, and Earl had loved her fiercely for that sacrifice of her own childlessness. Now, 8 months after Earl's death, Agnes was beginning to understand that his love had extended far beyond the tender moments they'd shared in the quiet bedroom of their farmhouse, beyond the weathered hands he'd held at the dinner table, beyond the way he'd whispered her name like a prayer in the darkness. His love had been woven into the very structure of their lives in ways she was only now beginning to discover. Earl had passed away on a cold February morning, slipping out of this world so quietly that Agnes didn't realize he was gone until the nurse whispered it to her. His heart, strong and stubborn for 72 years, had simply decided it had done enough work. The funeral was attended by most of Richland County. Earl had been a respected figure, a man who kept his word and paid his debts on time. But within a week of the service, Craig had arrived at the small farmhouse where Agnes still lived, paperwork in hand and a lawyer waiting in his expensive sedan parked in the gravel drive. The conversation was direct and delivered with what Craig believed was kindness, though Agnes heard only loss in every word. The farm, Craig explained with a thin smile, belonged to him and Diane. Earl's will had been updated in 1992. This was news to Agnes, and the property was to pass to his children. Agnes, of course, could continue living on the land, in the small cottage on the eastern edge of the property, but the main farmhouse, the dairy operation, the 80 acres of rolling green hills that Agnes had spent 46 years nurturing and defending, all of it now belonged to Craig and his sister. Agnes had felt the ground shift beneath her feet, though she remained perfectly still, nodding with the grace of a woman who had learned long ago not to show pain in front of others. What made the situation even more unbearable was the way Craig spoke about Earl's possessions, as if they were mere encumbrances to be liquidated. Within days of claiming his inheritance, Craig had begun suggesting, then insisting, that Agnes should consider selling off the old equipment. The rusted 1952 John Deere tractor that sat in the equipment shed was a particular source of irritation for him. "It's worthless, Mother," he'd said, using that calculated term, mother, with all the affection of someone addressing a tax form. "Pure junk. We can sell the scrap metal, at least get something out of it." But Agnes had refused. The tractor was the last thing she possessed that connected her to Earl's deepest self. She had watched her husband climb onto that machine every morning for nearly 5 decades, had seen him disappear into the rolling fields to check fences and tend the land, had understood that out there, in the wind and the grass and the endless sky, Earl found a kind of peace that the farmhouse could never offer him. The tractor was his poetry, written in iron and grease. Diane had called once, her voice tight with frustration. "Mother, honestly, Craig is right. You're being unreasonable. It's just a pile of rust, and frankly, it's not attractive on the property. It makes the place look abandoned." Agnes had listened to her stepdaughter's words without interrupting, without defending herself, and then she had quietly hung up the phone. She didn't bother explaining that she wasn't keeping the tractor for the way it looked, or for any practical reason at all. She was keeping it because it was one of the few things in her life that still carried the unmistakable scent of Earl, a complex smell of diesel fuel, metal, and the particular combination of sweat and earth that had clung to his clothes after a day of work. Letting go of the tractor would be admitting that Earl was truly gone, not just from this world, but from every corner of it that had mattered. Agnes wasn't ready to make that admission yet. The cottage where Agnes now lived was small, just 3 rooms and a bathroom that had been added in the 1960s without much attention to aesthetics. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people to stand in it at the same time, though of course that was no longer a concern. Agnes had brought very little with her from the main farmhouse. A few pieces of furniture that Craig and Diane deemed not of value. Some quilts her own mother had made, her reading glasses and her books, and the brown leather suitcase with brass clasps that she'd owned since her wedding day. That suitcase had traveled with her to Richland County as a young bride, had held the clothes she'd worn during the hardest and best years of her life, and now sat in the corner of her bedroom like a faithful dog waiting for a journey that might never come. She unpacked it only once a week, pulling out a fresh set of clothes, and the action had become something between a ritual and a prayer. On the hard days, she would open that suitcase and smell the leather, the old wool, the faint ghost of the perfume she'd worn in 1978 when she'd married Earl. And it would steady her. The winter after Earl's death was the longest of Agnes's life. The cottage was cold in a way the main farmhouse had never been, the walls thin and the heating system grudging. Agnes spent her days reading, her nights listening to the wind shake the windows, and her hours in between trying not to count how many hours there were in a day. She had friends in Richland County, women she'd worked with over the years, farmers' wives who knew the particular loneliness of rural life, but she found she couldn't quite manage the energy to see them. Instead, she spent her afternoons sitting on the small porch of the cottage, watching the fields that no longer belonged to her, watching the weathered red barn in the distance, watching the equipment shed where the John Deere tractor sat waiting. She had loved Earl Brolin with the whole of her heart, and while she understood intellectually that widowhood was the price of that love, understanding it didn't make it any easier to bear. It was on a Tuesday in early April, as Agnes was cleaning out some of Earl's personal effects, a task she'd been putting off with the fervor of someone avoiding a conversation they knew would break them, that she discovered the note. She was sitting at the small kitchen table in the cottage, sorting through Earl's toolbox, the one he'd kept in the barn for as long as she could remember. It was a simple wooden box with a leather handle, the interior lined with drawers and compartments, each one holding wrenches and sockets and screwdrivers organized by size and purpose. Earl had been meticulous about his tools, more organized with them than he'd ever been with anything else in his life. As Agnes was cleaning out the smallest compartment, a drawer that held nothing but precision screwdrivers, she found a folded piece of paper tucked behind the space where the drawer fitted into the frame. The paper was thin and aged, the crease deep with time, and when she unfolded it, she recognized Earl's handwriting immediately, the careful, deliberate script he used for everything from grocery lists to farm records. The note was brief. Aggie, the old girl keeps what matters. Look where the engine breathes. E. For a long moment, Agnes simply stared at those words, her weathered hands trembling. The old girl was what Earl had always called the John Deere tractor. It was his private name for her, spoken with a kind of affection he rarely showed for anything else. And, look where the engine breathes. That could only mean the engine compartment. Agnes read the note 3 times, and with each reading, a strange certainty began to crystallize in her mind. Earl had left her a message, not in words of explanation or love, though there was plenty of that in the simple fact that he'd hidden this note where only she would find it, but in the form of a clue, a puzzle, something that required her to take action. This was so fundamentally unlike Earl, who had never been a man of mystery or intrigue, that Agnes understood immediately that whatever he had hidden in that tractor, he considered it vitally important. Important enough to change the entire course of what came next. She sat for a long time after finding that note, the paper trembling in her hands. Outside, the April afternoon was growing cool, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the hills. Agnes knew she should move, should begin preparing dinner, should do any number of the small tasks that filled her days. Instead, she sat perfectly still, reading the note over and over, feeling the weight of what it represented. Earl was speaking to her from beyond death, asking her to do something, asking her to trust him, to believe that whatever he had hidden in that rusted tractor was worth the effort of retrieving. And there was something else, too, something that crystallized in Agnes's mind as she sat there in the fading light. If Earl had gone to the trouble of hiding something, if he had trusted it to the care of an old machine and a cryptic note, then it must be something he didn't want Craig and Diane to find. In that moment, Agnes understood that whatever had happened with the farm's inheritance, whatever version of events Craig had presented with his lawyers and his paperwork, there was another story, Earl's story, and he had left her the key to finding it. The next morning, Agnes woke before dawn and made a decision. She packed her brown leather suitcase, the one with the brass clasps, the one that had traveled with her since her wedding day. She packed it carefully, almost formally, as if she were preparing for a journey that might not allow for her return. She folded a clean flannel shirt, a change of underclothes, the book she was reading, her reading glasses in their case, and at the bottom, she placed Earl's note. She didn't know why she felt the need to pack a suitcase, why she couldn't simply walk the quarter-mile from the cottage to the equipment shed with empty hands. Perhaps it was because some part of her recognized that finding what was hidden in that tractor would change things fundamentally, would require her to carry something with her that couldn't be easily returned to the cottage. Perhaps it was simply that Agnes, at 70 years old, didn't do anything without intention and proper preparation. Either way, she found herself walking out of the cottage in the gray pre-dawn light, her suitcase in one hand, her heart pounding like that of a much younger woman about to commit a daring act. The walk to the equipment shed was a walk through 46 years of memory. The gravel drive where Agnes had run her hands over Earl's shoulders as they stood looking at the sunset. The fields where she'd found him sleeping in the afternoon after a night of difficult calving, exhausted and vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. The fence line where they'd held each other when word came that Earl's father had died, his feelings about his father complicated and deep in ways Agnes had never fully understood. The equipment shed itself was a structure that had stood since before Agnes had arrived at the farm, A simple open-sided shelter with a roof but no walls, its frame slowly surrendering to the weathering of seasons. The tractor sat within it like a sleeping animal, and as Agnes approached, she found herself walking more slowly, as if approaching something sacred. The tractor was exactly as she remembered it, chipped green and yellow paint, the rubber seat cracked and faded, the massive rear tires gone flat long ago and sunk into the dirt. Bird nests clustered in the exhaust stack, undisturbed. Cobwebs stretched across the steering wheel. The metal was streaked with rust in patterns that looked almost like tears. Agnes set down her suitcase carefully and climbed onto the tractor seat, something she hadn't done in years. The seat was smaller than she remembered, harder, and when she gripped the steering wheel, she could almost feel Earl's hands gripping it first, could almost smell the particular scent of his work clothes and his skin. She sat there for a long time, just breathing, just being present with the machine and the memory of the man who had loved it. The engine compartment was not locked, but it was seized with rust and age. Agnes had to use one of Earl's wrenches, a tool she'd brought from the cottage toolbox. Perhaps she'd been planning this journey longer than she consciously realized. She worked at the fasteners, her strong, square hands still capable, despite her 70 years, despite the arthritis that had begun to claim her knuckles. One by one, the bolts loosened. Her hands grew streaked with rust and grease, but she didn't stop. She had removed the final bolt and was working on getting the heavy compartment cover open when something inside the engine block caught the morning light. It was metal, reflecting gold, and it didn't belong to the tractor. It took Agnes several minutes to position herself properly and see it clearly. A steel box, roughly the size of a toolbox, welded directly to the inside of the engine frame. For a moment, Agnes simply stared at it. Here was what Earl had left her. Here was what he had wanted to protect so desperately that he'd hidden it in the heart of a machine he loved, in the one place on the farm where Craig would never think to look, where he wouldn't even dare venture. Agnes climbed down from the tractor seat and went back to retrieve her suitcase, and from it she pulled the toolbox she'd brought. Earl's precision tools, the small wrenches and bolt cutters and pliers that he'd kept sharp and organized. She returned to the engine compartment and began working on the bolts that held the steel box to the tractor frame. The task took nearly an hour. Her hands ached, and her breath came harder than it used to. But Agnes was determined. She had come this far. She would not stop now. When the steel box finally came free, it was heavier than she'd expected. She held it in both hands, feeling the weight of whatever secrets it contained, and her eyes filled with tears. How long had Earl carried this with him? How many times had he worked on this tractor, maintaining it, caring for it, knowing that inside the engine compartment lay the truth that he couldn't speak aloud? Agnes climbed down from the tractor, cradling the box like a child, and sat down on a hay bale that had been stored in the equipment shed for so long it had begun to decompose. She set the box on her lap and took a moment to simply breathe, to acknowledge the magnitude of what was about to happen. The box itself was simple, fireproof steel painted a dull gray, the kind of thing you might see in an office or a bank. The latch was sealed, not with a lock, but with Earl's intention, with his careful placement and the passage of time. Agnes worked the latch open, and the lid swung upward with a creak that sounded like the earth itself shifting. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and old paper, were the documents that would change everything. The deed to the farm, but not the 1992 deed that Craig had shown her. This was an older document, dated 1978, the year Agnes had married Earl. And on it, written in the careful script of a lawyer long since passed, were both names, Earl Brolin and Agnes Brolin, joint tenants in common. Agnes's name was on the deed. Agnes's name was on the land. Beneath the deed, wrapped in the same protective oilcloth, was another document, a letter in handwriting Agnes recognized as belonging to Earl's father, Walter, who had passed away 15 years ago. The letter was a confession. Walter admitted, in careful words that seemed to cost him everything, that he had manipulated Earl into signing a new deed in 1992, removing Agnes's name from the property. He explained that he had never truly accepted Agnes as family, that he'd been influenced by the attitudes of people in their community who still regarded her as an outsider, a woman who'd married a widower and stepped into a ready-made family. He'd believed, he wrote, that the farm should go to Earl's true children, the ones born to his first wife. But he was old, he wrote, and approaching death with too much clarity about the harm he'd caused. He wanted it on record, before God and any jury that might care to judge him, that he had cheated his son and that son's beloved wife out of their rightful inheritance. The letter ended with a request that Earl forgive him, and a final line, "Agnes deserves what is hers. I was wrong." Beneath the confession letter, Agnes found another document, not a legal one this time, but something far more precious. It was a stack of savings bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds purchased over what must have been decades, and attached to each one with a label in Earl's handwriting was a name, Agnes Brolin. There were dozens of them, some going back to 1982, others more recent. Agnes had no idea how much money these represented, but the sheer accumulation of them spoke to a kind of patient, determined love that made her heart ache. Earl had been building this fortune for her in secret, buying bonds regularly, storing them here where only she would find them. An insurance policy against hardship, against abandonment, against the possibility that when he was gone, she might be alone and vulnerable. But beneath all of this, beneath the deeds and confessions and bonds, lay something else. A letter in Earl's own handwriting, several pages thick, the script becoming increasingly shaky as it went on. Agnes pulled this letter out with trembling hands and began to read the words her husband had written for her, words he'd known she would find only after his death had made them necessary. "My dearest Aggie, if you're reading this, then you've done what I asked, and you've found what I've hidden. I hope it hasn't taken you too long, and I hope you haven't suffered over much in the discovering. I would give anything to be there with you right now, to explain all of this in person, to watch your face as you understand the full scope of what I've been planning for you. But life rarely offers us what we'd like, and so I'm writing these words to a future I won't see, in the hope that they'll find you when you need them most. Aggie, you need to understand something. When my father came to me in 1992 and asked me to sign a new deed removing your name, I knew what he was doing. I understood completely the message he was sending, that you weren't truly family, that your claim on the farm was less valid than that of my children from my first marriage. It hurt me, that moment. Hurt me in a way I've never been good at expressing. But I couldn't refuse him. He was dying, even then, though none of us knew it would take 13 more years. And I had learned long ago that you can't change a man's heart by fighting him. So I signed the deed, but I started buying bonds the same week, Aggie. I promised myself right then that whatever my father took from you in his legal documents, I would replace with this. I've been buying them ever since, For 30 years now, every extra penny that came to me, every bonus from the dairy operation, every bit of profit that was mine to keep, I've converted to bonds in your name. I've hidden them here because I knew, Aggie, I knew that Craig would try to cheat you. He's always been his grandfather's grandson, always believed that the farm was his inheritance, that you were just a woman who married into the family and could be cast out when you were no longer useful. But you haven't been not useful, my love. You've been the heart of this farm. You've been the reason it prospered. You've been the reason I had anything worth being faithful to, anything worth protecting. Agnes had to stop reading at that point. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely hold the paper, and her vision had blurred with tears so heavy she couldn't see the words anymore. She sat on the hay bale in the equipment shed, the letter in her lap, the deeds and bonds surrounding her like a kind of armor, and she wept for the husband who had loved her so much that he'd spent decades building a fortress of financial security around her heart. She wept for the injustice she'd endured, without knowing he'd been working to remedy it all along. She wept for the loneliness of being an outsider, of never quite being accepted, and she wept for the fact that Earl had understood all of it and had chosen to protect her rather than confront it directly. This was how Earl loved, not with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but with patient, methodical devotion, with the slow accumulation of actions designed to shelter someone else from harm. When she could finally read again, Agnes returned to the letter, and what she found there was even more significant than the financial details or the legal ramifications. Earl had written about his feelings for her, about the day he'd met her at a county fair, when he was already a widower with 2 young children, and she was a young woman visiting from Madison with a friend who was dating a local boy. He had written about watching her help a child who had fallen and scraped her knee, about noticing the way she moved through the world with both strength and gentleness, about knowing within 5 minutes of meeting her that she was the person he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. He wrote about their wedding day, about how nervous he'd been, afraid she'd realize she was marrying a broken man with too much baggage, and how astonished he'd been when she'd simply smiled at him and said, "I know what I'm getting. I'm choosing it anyway." He wrote about the years that followed, about raising Craig and Diane, about the hard winters when the farm barely survived, about the good years when the dairy operation prospered. He wrote about the way Agnes had transformed the farmhouse into a home, about the quilts she'd made, the meals she'd cooked, the children she'd loved as her own. He wrote about watching her get older, watching her hands become more calloused, her hair turn white, her face deepen with lines earned through 60 years of living. And he wrote about never, for a single moment, regretting his choice to marry her. He wrote, "You are the best thing that ever happened to this land, Aggie. You are the reason it means anything at all. When I'm gone, and you'll know I'm gone because you'll be reading this, I need you to know that you don't have to earn your place here anymore. You earned it 1,000 times over, 1,000 times every day. The land is yours because you made it yours. The home is yours because you made it a home. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let Craig or anyone else make you feel like you're a guest on your own life." The letter went on to explain, in practical terms, what Agnes needed to do. The 1978 deed was the legal one, regardless of what the 1992 deed said. A lawyer in Madison, whose name and phone number Earl had written down, could confirm this and had already been retained by Earl at considerable expense. The savings bonds, combined with the recognition of her claim to the property, would give Agnes more than enough security to never have to depend on Craig or Diane for anything. Earl advised her to contact the lawyer immediately to take possession of the documents and to not let anyone, not Craig, not his lawyers, not anyone else, convince her that she didn't have a claim on what was rightfully hers. The tone of the letter shifted in these practical passages, becoming almost stern, as if Earl understood that his widow would be tempted to be graceful and accommodating in the face of being cheated, and he was determined to prevent that. The letter ended with a postscript. "I love you, Agnes. I have loved you since the moment I saw you, and I love you still, in whatever way love survives death. Come back to this old machine sometimes when you're missing me. Remember that she kept the best things safe, and remember, my darling wife, that you belong here. You have always belonged here. You belong on this farm, on this land, in this life we built together. Don't let anyone take that from you." Agnes sat holding that letter for a long time after she finished reading it. The morning had progressed, and the sun was now high enough to cast proper shadows in the equipment shed. She was aware, distantly, that she should be doing something, contacting the lawyer, making phone calls, taking action. But for now, she simply sat with her husband's words, with his love, with the overwhelming realization that Earl had been protecting her all along, even from beyond the grave. He had known his children would try to cheat her. He had known the law, had known about the earlier deed, had prepared meticulously to ensure she'd be taken care of. This was his final gift to her, not just the money or the property, but the knowledge that he had valued her, had fought for her in his quiet way, had believed absolutely in her right to be here. The next week was a blur of action and revelation. Agnes called the lawyer in Madison, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had been retained by Earl 15 years earlier with instructions to assist his wife after his death. Patricia was brisk and efficient and seemed unsurprised by any of this, which suggested that Earl had prepared her thoroughly for exactly the situation that had unfolded. She examined the 1978 deed, the confession letter from Walter, and the savings bonds, and she assured Agnes that her legal claim to the farm was airtight. The 1992 deed, achieved through coercion and without proper legal representation for Agnes, would be invalid in any courtroom. The confession letter from Walter, while not strictly necessary, would certainly help establish that the original deed was the one legally binding one. And the savings bonds, Patricia had explained that these were Agnes's personal property, purchased in her name, and had nothing to do with the farm dispute at all. The revelation of all this to Craig was every bit as unpleasant as Agnes had feared. Craig arrived at the cottage on a Tuesday afternoon, his face already flushed with anger. Apparently, Patricia's lawyer had already made contact with his lawyer to discuss the legal situation. He had the 1992 deed in his hand, waving it like a flag of battle. Agnes, meanwhile, simply sat at her small kitchen table and waited for him to finish his tirade. When he finally paused for breath, she calmly explained what she had found, and then she handed him a copy of the 1978 deed, a copy of his grandfather's confession letter, and a summary from Patricia Chen outlining Agnes's legal claim. She watched his face as he read these documents, watched the anger transform into shock, and then into a kind of desperate scrambling for some way to salvage his position. "This is ridiculous," he said finally, his voice shaken. "My grandfather would never have written something like this. It's a forgery. You forged it yourself to try to claim the farm." "No," Agnes said simply. "Your grandfather wrote it before he died, in 1995. He left it for me to find. It's in his handwriting. Your lawyer will confirm that when you show him." "And these bonds, where did you get $340,000 in savings bonds? You didn't earn that money." "Your father purchased them," Agnes explained, keeping her voice steady and reasonable. "Over 30 years, he put them all in my name. They're mine." Craig's face had gone white. The implications were becoming clear to him. His inheritance wasn't what he'd believed it to be. The farm's ownership was more complicated now, and Agnes's financial position was far stronger than he'd imagined. He left the cottage without another word, and Agnes never saw him display anger like that again. There was a kind of resignation in him after that day, an acknowledgement that he'd been outmaneuvered by his late father, that the man he'd expected to dominate him with legal documents had instead been undone by love and long planning. Within 3 months, the legal situation had been resolved. Agnes retained Patricia Chen as her lawyer and sued for recognition of her ownership rights to the farm. Craig's lawyer initially fought the claim, but once Patricia produced the 1978 deed and began citing case law about coerced legal documents and the confession letter from Walter, the resistance crumbled. The settlement was straightforward. Agnes retained her original claim to the farm through the 1978 deed. Craig and Diane retained some portion of what their father had owned, enough to prevent them from being completely disinherited, but the land, the main farmhouse, the equipment, all of it went to Agnes. She also received the interest that had accumulated on the savings bonds over the 30 years Earl had been purchasing them, which brought their total value to just over $450,000. Patricia had advised her to invest this conservatively and live off the interest, which would provide her with a comfortable income for the rest of her life. Diane, when she heard the news, simply disappeared. She wrote Agnes a single letter, which arrived 3 weeks later, saying only, "I understand now that Father loved Agnes more than he loved us. I'm not sure how to feel about that." Agnes never heard from her stepdaughter again, and while that hurt, Agnes had loved Diane as her own daughter, had raised her with the same care she'd given Craig. She also understood that Diane was grieving not just the loss of her expected inheritance, but also the loss of a family structure she'd believed to be true. Sometimes love reveals truths that are difficult for people to bear, and sometimes those revelations break relationships that have been built on misunderstanding. Craig was harder to navigate. He remained living on the property for several months after the settlement, in a cottage that Agnes owned but that he'd claimed as his own. The tension between them was palpable during this time. Agnes would sometimes see him working in the fields, hired hands working under his direction, and she'd remember the boy she'd helped raise, the young man she'd driven to college, the adult she'd welcomed into adult conversations around the dinner table. But whatever connection had existed between them seemed to have been severed by the discovery of his attempt to cheat her. Eventually, Craig sold the cottage and moved to Madison, where he took a position at an insurance company and seemed to mostly forget the farm existed. Years later, Agnes would receive a letter of apology from him, handwritten and sincere, asking her forgiveness for having tried to take advantage of her grief. Agnes would read that letter, fold it carefully, and place it in the toolbox next to Earl's note. She didn't respond to Craig, but neither did she burn the letter. Some bridges, once burned, don't deserve to be rebuilt, but they can be acknowledged as having once existed. The restoration of the farm was a project that occupied Agnes for nearly 2 years. She used a portion of her newfound financial security to hire contractors to repair the main farmhouse, to modernize the dairy equipment, and to begin planning a new future for the 80 acres that had been in the Brolin family since 1978. But the first major project she undertook was the restoration of the 1952 John Deere tractor. She found a young man in Richland County who specialized in farm equipment restoration, a person named Jacob, who had grown up with mechanically minded parents and had the patience and skill to bring an old machine back to life. Agnes brought him to the equipment shed and explained what needed to be done, and Jacob had simply smiled and said, "I know exactly how to treat her." The restoration took 6 months. Agnes would walk over to the equipment shed regularly to check on progress, to watch as the rust was cleaned away, as the engine was rebuilt, as new paint was applied in authentic John Deere, green and yellow. She would sit on the hay bales and talk to Jacob while he worked. And gradually, the story came out. Not all of it, never quite all of it, but enough that Jacob understood he was helping to restore something sacred. When the tractor was finally complete, when Jacob started the engine and it roared to life with a sound that hadn't been heard in years, Agnes wept. The sound of that engine was the sound of Earl's mornings, the sound of his purpose, the sound of him still being present in some fundamental way. Agnes decided then that the tractor would remain on the farm, not hidden away in an equipment shed, but displayed with honor. She had Jacob help her position it beside the red barn, in a place where it could be seen from the main farmhouse. She placed a small plaque on it, simple brass, nothing fancy, that read, "In loving memory of Earl Brolin, 1924 to 2010. He loved this land and the woman who shares it." When locals drove by the farm and saw the restored tractor sitting with obvious pride beside the barn, they would ask Agnes about it, and she would tell them the story, not the whole story, never quite all of it, but enough that they understood something profound had happened out here, that this farm held secrets and love stories that transcended normal inheritance disputes. As for the dairy operation itself, Agnes decided not to continue it. She was too old to manage a full working dairy, and hiring a farm manager seemed impersonal. Instead, she leased the 80 acres to a young family from the county, a couple in their 30s who had grown up with farming but had been priced out of buying their own land. Agnes set the lease terms at rates well below market value because she understood what it meant to be locked out of something you loved, to have the land you wanted to work belong to someone else. The young couple brought new life to the farm, and their children would run through the fields just as Craig and Diane had done, just as Agnes had once imagined her own children might do. But these were someone else's children, and Agnes was at peace with that. Life had given her what it intended to give her, and she had learned to be grateful for that rather than angry about what had been withheld. By her 73rd birthday, Agnes had transformed from a woman who'd been cast into poverty and displacement into a person of considerable means and genuine peace. The brown leather suitcase with the brass clasps still sat in the corner of her bedroom. She'd moved back to the main farmhouse after the settlement, but now it was less a symbol of impending exile and more a simple artifact, a reminder of where she'd come from and what she'd survived. She had hired a woman named Marie to help her with the housekeeping, because at 73 her hands could no longer manage the sort of physically demanding cleaning and maintenance that a house the size of the farmhouse required. Marie was close to Agnes's age, a widow herself, and they developed a friendship that went beyond employer and employee. Together they would sit on the porch in the afternoons and talk about their late husbands, about the particular loneliness of age, about the way that time moved differently when you were older. Some days lasted forever and some years seemed to disappear. The equipment shed where Agnes had found Earl's hidden fortune was eventually torn down and replaced with a small barn where the restored John Deere tractor could be properly stored during harsh weather. But Agnes insisted on keeping a small covered area where people could view the tractor, where visitors to the farm could see it and understand its importance. Local school groups would sometimes visit the farm on educational excursions about agricultural history, and Agnes would show them the tractor and talk about what farming meant, about the generations of work that had gone into sustaining the land. She never mentioned the hidden fortune or the legal battles, but there was something in the way she spoke about the tractor, a reverence and a kind of intimate knowledge that made the students understand they were looking at something that mattered. In the autumn of her 75th year, as the leaves were turning gold and red across the Wisconsin countryside, Agnes made a decision. She wrote letters to Craig and Diane, separate letters, explaining that she was establishing a foundation in Earl's name. The foundation would provide no-interest loans to young farmers looking to establish their operations, would help preserve agricultural lands from being sold to developers, and would support agricultural education in Richland County schools. She was funding this foundation with a significant portion of the savings bonds, not all of them because she needed to maintain her own security, but enough that this charitable work could continue for generations. She sent copies of the legal documents establishing the foundation to both Craig and Diane, and she invited them, if they wished, to serve on the board of directors. Craig didn't respond for 3 months. When he finally did, it was with a message saying he would accept a position on the board. Diane never responded at all, and Agnes didn't push. Some relationships were meant to be repaired, and others were meant to be acknowledged as broken and then let go of with grace. Agnes had found that in her later years, she had less patience for forcing things to be other than what they were. If Diane wanted to remain distant, Agnes would respect that choice. She had spent enough time trying to be accepted by a family that had never fully accepted her. Now she was busy building a new kind of family, one made up of the people she'd helped, the young farmers who'd bought land with no-interest loans, the school children who learned about agriculture on her farm, the staff of the foundation that was beginning to take shape. This was the family Earl had wanted for her, Agnes believed. Not a family imposed by marriage, but a family created through generosity and shared purpose. The first year following the legal settlement was filled with small victories and quiet moments of peace that Agnes had not experienced in decades. She hired contractors to begin the systematic restoration of the main farmhouse, and she found herself involved in decisions about paint colors, window replacements, and the restoration of original hardwood floors that had been covered with linoleum in the 1960s. For the first time in her adult life, Agnes was making decisions for herself alone, without having to consider Earl's preferences or the needs of his children. The experience was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. She would stand in rooms, running her hands along walls, imagining how she wanted them to look, and then second-guess herself, wondering if she was making the right choices. But gradually, as the farmhouse began to transform under her direction, she began to trust her own instincts. The kitchen was painted a soft butter yellow that reminded her of summer wheat. The bedroom was a gentle blue-gray that matched the Wisconsin sky on overcast days. The living room walls were restored to show the original beadboard beneath the layers of wallpaper and paint that had accumulated over the decades. During this time, Agnes developed a routine that brought her both comfort and structure. Every morning, she would wake at dawn, make a pot of strong coffee, and sit on the porch overlooking the fields while the sun rose. She would watch the young couple who leased the farmland from her working in the fields, and she would feel a sense of peace, knowing that the land was being cared for, that her decision to lease rather than work the dairy herself had been the right one. In the afternoons, she would often walk out to the barn, where the restored tractor sat gleaming in its fresh green and yellow paint. She would touch the restored leather of the seat, run her hands along the steering wheel, and simply sit in silence, remembering. She never sat on the tractor during these visits. That felt like something sacred, something she wanted to preserve for special occasions. Instead, she would stand beside it and let her memories flow through her like a current. As the foundation that Agnes had established began to take shape, she found herself energized in ways she hadn't been in years. The work of reviewing applications from young farmers seeking no-interest loans filled her days with purpose. She would read about their dreams, their struggles, their determination to build something meaningful from the land, and she would think about what Earl would have wanted. Many of the applicants were couples, and many of them were facing the same kinds of obstacles that Agnes and Earl had faced: lack of capital, limited access to traditional financing, the challenge of competing with large corporate agricultural operations. Agnes made sure that each application received careful consideration, that each applicant was treated with respect and dignity, and that loans were granted to those who demonstrated genuine commitment to sustainable farming practices and land stewardship. One of the first loans the foundation granted went to a young couple named Michael and Sarah Chen, who wanted to establish an organic vegetable farm on 20 acres of land they'd managed to scrape together money to purchase, though the property was in poor condition and required significant investment in soil remediation and farm infrastructure. When Michael came to meet Agnes to discuss the application, he brought photographs of their property and explained their vision to grow vegetables specifically for local restaurants and farmers' markets, to employ sustainable practices that would build the soil rather than deplete it, to create a business that could support a family and potentially employ other people from the community. Agnes listened to him with the focused attention of someone who understood that she was listening to someone's deepest hopes. When she approved the loan, a substantial amount, enough to cover the costs of equipment, soil amendment, and the building of a small storage and packing facility, Michael had actually cried. "This changes everything for us," he'd said simply. "It gives us a chance to build what we've always wanted." Agnes had felt Earl's presence in that moment, had felt the rightness of using his savings, his patient accumulation of bonds, his decades of careful financial planning to help people like Michael and Sarah achieve their dreams. By the second year after the settlement, Agnes had established herself as a significant figure in Richland County agricultural circles. She was invited to speak at the county fair about the foundation's work, to participate in agricultural development boards, to consult on conservation easement programs that would preserve agricultural land from being developed. She became known as a woman of substance, of wisdom, of genuine concern for the future of farming in the region. Some people in the county knew her story, that she'd been cheated by her stepchildren, that she'd discovered a hidden fortune, that she'd claimed her rightful inheritance. But Agnes never spoke about these things herself. Instead, she let her work speak for her. Let the success of the farmers she'd helped represent the values she believed in. One afternoon in the spring of her 74th year, Agnes received a visitor she wasn't expecting. Craig appeared at the farmhouse, not announced, not prepared for, simply arriving in his sedan on a Tuesday morning when Agnes was working in the garden, planting early greens in the raised beds she'd had constructed. She saw him coming and straightened her back, bracing herself for whatever confrontation or negotiation might be coming. But Craig's face, when she turned to face him fully, showed only weariness and something that might have been shame. He asked if they could talk, and Agnes invited him inside for coffee, a gesture that surprised them both. Craig sat at her kitchen table, the kitchen she'd painted butter yellow, the kitchen that had been her sanctuary, and he began to tell her a story. He explained that in the years since the settlement, he'd been thinking about what had happened, about the discovery of his father's hidden savings bonds, about the confession letter from his grandfather. He'd been seeing a therapist in Madison who specialized in family dynamics and inheritance issues, and through that work, he'd come to understand some difficult truths about himself. He'd wanted the farm because he'd believed it would make him feel successful, make him feel worthy, make him feel like he finally belonged somewhere. But the discovery that his father had valued Agnes so much more highly than he'd valued his own biological children had shattered something in Craig's understanding of himself. And slowly, painfully, Craig had come to realize that his father had been right. His father had seen that Agnes was the better person, the more devoted person, the person who truly deserved the farm and everything on it. Craig's visit lasted nearly 2 hours. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He understood, he said, that some things couldn't be forgiven, that trust once broken was difficult to rebuild. But he wanted Agnes to know that he understood now why his father had done what he'd done. He wanted Agnes to know that he was proud of the work she was doing with the foundation, that he'd watched from a distance as the organization had grown and helped young farmers establish their operations, and that he believed his father would have been proud too. He wanted Agnes to know that being a stepson to her for those early years, before everything fell apart, had actually shaped who he was, and that some of his best memories were of times she'd helped him, taught him, cared for him. When he left the farmhouse that afternoon, Agnes walked him to his car, and though they didn't embrace, they did shake hands, a genuine handshake between two people who had both been wounded by the same situation and had each, in their own way, slowly begun to heal. That conversation with Craig gave Agnes permission to think about reconciliation in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. She wrote a letter to Diane, a real letter, not just a document establishing a charitable foundation, but a personal letter in which she explained what she'd been thinking about, how she'd been feeling. She wrote about Diane's childhood, about the summer Diane had been 14 and had broken her arm, and how Agnes had driven her to the emergency room at 2 in the morning and had sat beside her bed in the hospital all through the night. She wrote about teaching Diane how to make bread, about the way Diane had laughed as a girl, about the hopes Agnes had held for her as she grew into a young woman. She wrote about the betrayal she'd felt when Diane had sided with Craig against her, but she also wrote about understanding now that Diane had been caught in a difficult situation between her brother and her stepmother, and that understanding didn't mean the hurt went away, but it meant she could hold the hurt with some compassion for the circumstances that had created it. Agnes wasn't expecting a response to that letter, and when 3 weeks passed without hearing from Diane, she told herself it was fine, that she'd written the letter for herself anyway, to express what she needed to express. But then a thick envelope arrived, postmarked from Chicago, and Agnes's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter from Diane, and it was clear that Diane had cried as she wrote it. Diane had written about the shame she'd felt at how she'd treated Agnes, about how she'd allowed herself to listen to her brother's resentment, and had adopted it as her own, when in her heart she'd always known that Agnes was a good woman and a good stepmother. She wrote about the times Agnes had been there for her, the broken arm, yes, but also 100 other moments, and she wrote about how she'd tried for years not to think about those times because it made the guilt too overwhelming to bear. She wrote that she didn't expect Agnes to forgive her, but that she was trying now to be a better person, and that understanding what her father had done, reading that confession letter and those journal entries, had helped her understand the depth of love that could exist, the kind of love that protected people Even after death, Diane's letter ended with a request. Could Diane visit the farm sometime? Could they have coffee together, the way they might have if things had gone differently? Agnes wrote back immediately, saying that of course Diane could visit, that she would be welcome not just as a stepdaughter, but as a person Agnes had once loved very deeply and had never stopped caring about. When Diane visited the following summer, it was awkward at first, but gradually, over the course of a long afternoon, spent sitting on the porch overlooking the fields, something began to shift between them. They didn't pretend that what had happened hadn't happened. The betrayal was real, the hurt was real, the time lost was real, but they also didn't let those realities define the entire relationship. By the time Diane left to return to Chicago, she and Agnes had made tentative plans for Diane to return in the fall. And there was a fragile but genuine hope in both of them that something meaningful might be rebuilt. On a clear afternoon in October, Agnes walked out to the barn where the restored John Deere tractor sat in a place of honor. She had brought a picnic basket with her, bread and cheese and fruit, the things Earl had always loved, and she sat on the tractor seat, the way she had that first morning when she discovered the steel box hidden in the engine compartment. She was older now, stiffer, her hands more arthritic, her breath more labored, but she was also freer than she'd ever been, more secure, more at peace with her place in the world. She sat on that tractor seat and opened the picnic basket and ate her lunch, and as she did, she felt Earl's presence in a way she hadn't felt it since before his death. Not as grief, not as loss, but as presence, as a kind of gentle companionship. He was still with her, not in the way she'd wanted, not in the flesh, not in the day-to-day reality of a shared life, but in the ways that mattered most, in the land beneath her feet, in the security he'd built around her, in the knowledge that he had valued her so completely, that he'd spent the last decades of his life ensuring she would never be vulnerable to the kind of betrayal Craig had tried to perpetrate. As the sun began to set on that October afternoon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange and deep blue, Agnes gathered up her picnic basket and prepared to return to the farmhouse. Before she climbed down from the tractor seat, she placed her weathered hand on the restored steering wheel and spoke aloud, something she rarely did. "Thank you, Earl," she said simply. "Thank you for loving me so well, even after death." The autumn wind moved through the fields, rustling the dried grasses and the trees in their fall colors, and Agnes could almost hear in that wind the sound of the tractor engine starting, the sound of her husband driving out to check on the land one more time, the sound of his presence in this place they had built together. She smiled, the lines of her face deepening with the expression, and she made her way back to the main house, her brown leather suitcase having finally, after all these years, been put to rest in a corner of her bedroom. No longer needed for escape, but treasured as a reminder of where she'd come from and how very far she'd traveled. The story of Agnes Brolin and the hidden treasures in her late husband's broken tractor became something of a legend in Richland County. Local newspapers picked up the story, and journalists from Madison came out to interview Agnes about her foundation, about the young farmers she'd helped launch their operations, about the meaning of love and loyalty in the face of family betrayal. Agnes gave these interviews reluctantly, never quite comfortable being the subject of attention, but she understood that her story mattered because it spoke to something universal, the experience of being undervalued, of being taken for granted, and then discovering that someone you loved had seen your true worth all along. She was the voice for everyone who'd ever felt like an outsider in their own family, like someone whose contributions went unnoticed and unappreciated. But she was also the voice for the power of patience, for the way that love expressed through quiet action could ultimately triumph over greed and resentment. The restored John Deere tractor became a symbol, not just of Earl's love for Agnes, but of the possibility that justice could prevail, that what was rightfully yours could be returned to you, that hidden things could be brought to light. Every farmer in Richland County who received a no-interest loan from the Brolin Foundation carried with them the knowledge that they were participating in a legacy of love and fairness that had been established because one woman had the courage to follow a mysterious note into an equipment shed and discover that her husband had been protecting her all along, even after death had taken him away. In the end, that was Agnes's true inheritance, not the land, not the money, not even the satisfaction of having defeated Craig's attempt to cheat her, but the knowledge that she had been worthy of such love, that she had mattered profoundly to someone, and that she had the power to create meaning and opportunity for others.